Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The topic for this webinar is the If It Ain't Broke, It Still Needs Maintenance, How to Effectively Maintain Blue-Green Infrastructure. I want to first thank the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission Water Resource Center for inviting us to speak today and for sponsoring this event. I'm Dan Weibel. I'm an engineer with Jacobs. I've been in practice for a little over 20 years, and my specialty is low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure. I'm joined today by my colleague, Susan Beck, and a representative from one of our really awesome clients, the City of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Kate Austin. Susan and Kate, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. As Dan mentioned, I work with him at Jacobs. I am also a water resources engineer with about 20 years experience, and Dan and I have been working together for all of that time, actually, most of that time, designing green infrastructure systems and planning green infrastructure programs and implementation, and we've worked closely with Kate.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Austin. I'm the Green Infrastructure Asset Coordinator with the City of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I've been with the city about 6 years now, and I've been working in the water quality world for about the last 10 years. And looking forward to talking with you today.
Great, thank you both. Well, with that, we'll just launch in. We have a lot of ground to cover in this hour. And let's see if I can advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so this is the outline of our presentation. It should match pretty closely with the summary that went out with the invite. We're going to start with a quick background. What is blue-green infrastructure? Why does it matter? We're going to get into some of the typical challenges and myths around green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure. We're going to dive into maintenance planning and programming, really spend a good bit of time on that. Why is maintenance important? What are some of the barriers to success? What about commitment and funding? How can we plan for success? And then the next step after planning, how can we design for maintenance, for better maintenance, more feasible and easier maintenance? And then at the end, Kate is going to talk about her experiences maintaining green infrastructure in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We'll close with some resources, a lot of good links, helpful, useful links, and then hopefully have some time for Q&A. So before we dive in, we do have a poll question that should come up. The question is, are you planning to implement blue-green infrastructure in the near future? And the answer is, as you can see, multiple choice. Yes, we have implemented some type of BGI. Yes, we're planning to, but we haven't done so before. We are considering it as a possibility, or no, not unless we're absolutely forced to do so. So we'll give everyone a couple seconds to fill this out. And we can see the results here. Actually, okay, so more than half of everyone on this call has implemented some type of BGI. About a third is considering it as a possibility, and about 12% said no, or yes, we're planning to, but we haven't done so before. And then 6% of you said, no, not unless we're forced to, or we have to for some reason. So good to know where we stand. Thank you for answering. And if we can advance, okay, we're going to get into the background as I mentioned before. So what is blue-green infrastructure and why does it matter? So blue-green infrastructure, it's really made up of course, the blue and the green. The blue is things like wet ponds, detention basins. These are practices that temporarily store large volumes of water and don't really significantly rely on vegetation. Green infrastructure, on the other hand, are things like bioretention, permeable pavements. These are systems that use either vegetation or soils or rainwater harvesting to treat and reduce the smaller, more frequent stormwater events. So when we put those together, it becomes a strategy for controlling or treating water quality, having community enriching benefits. Those are all the green side of things. And then we also couple that with the blue side of things, the flood reduction and the climate resiliency. So that's really what we're talking about here when we say blue-green infrastructure. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because it's responsive to regulatory drivers, whether it's new or redevelopment stormwater regs, if it's MS4 requirements, if it's CSO requirements, green building certifications. There's a variety of those regulatory drivers that exist and really push the use of blue-green infrastructure. Of course, the primary benefits are reduced volume of runoff, reduced flow rate, reducing pollutants, typical pollutants that are in stormwater runoff, and of course, lots and lots of other benefits from groundwater recharge to resiliency, improved aesthetics and quality of life, improved safety and walkability, localized flooding reduction, biodiversity. The list really goes on, and I don't want to skip the last bullet there. The social value, the equity, jobs creation, all those things are real and quantifiable benefits of blue-green infrastructure. Oops, went too far there. But of course, it's not easy. There are real challenges to implementing blue-green infrastructure, and there's also myths. There's the perceptions that are out there. Of course, we've all heard these. Maybe we think these. That blue-green won't work with clay soils or steep slopes. There's not enough space. There's just too much rain. There's too much flooding. What about mosquitoes? The winters we have here are so harsh that it's not going to last the winter. We've done it before. It hasn't worked. Too many bad experiences. We have so many utilities. How do we work around those? We've all heard NIMBY, not in my backyard. We just don't want it here. It's too expensive. And then, of course, what we're really focusing on today, it's just too hard to maintain. So is it really too hard to maintain? Is that a challenge? Is that a myth? I think it's a little bit of both, and we'll get into that and hopefully dispel the myth that exists around it. So why is maintenance critical? These are fairly obvious. Of course, it ensures the long-term performance of these practices. These are capital investments. These are assets that we're putting in our communities, so we want to protect them. It's important for aesthetics. We don't want these practices to become eyesores. We have to meet regulatory requirements, whether it's on the public or the private side. There's public health issues, whether it's, I mentioned the idea of mosquito breeding and things like that. There's public community perceptions. When we see water in a rain garden or a bioretention area, is that water supposed to be there? It's ponding. Is that normal? Is that what we want? We have children that play in these communities, they play on these streets and in these parks. And of course, there's a lot of common failures and a lot of lessons learned. So these are all real world examples here. There's the lower left-hand corner of a porous asphalt installation. We might look at that, and if we don't know what it is, we might think, well, it's about time we seal that up. And the lesson we learned there is, signage, education, all those things matter. We have to really get the word out that this material is porous, and you don't want to repave over it or seal it. What are those weeds doing in that planter? So on the right side, you see an example. The before, that was a stormwater planter alongside of a street. A resident that lives right there thought those were all weeds and just pulled them all out. Of course, trash collects where water collects. Bioretention areas in residential developments, residential communities might look like good spots to toss those old tires or whatever trash is lying around. And of course, we put in things like filter inserts, and we may say, well, just relax, there's an insert in there. We don't have to worry about that for a while. It's good, we're good. So that's obviously not the case. Everything does have to be maintained. And of course, there's a lot of barriers to effective green or blue-green infrastructure maintenance. There's the lack of funding for operations and maintenance. That really this comes down to resources. Maybe our communities don't have the specialized equipment we needed. Maybe we don't have the staff that we need. We don't have the training in specialized needs of blue-green infrastructure. We don't have consistent inspection and maintenance procedures or enforcement policies. The public's just not aware of what these things are, what they do, how they should function. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Susan now, and she's going to get into, how do we integrate new and different O&M protocols into our existing O&M programs and operating budgets? How do we really institutionalize blue-green infrastructure maintenance?
Thanks, Dan. If I get control here. There we go. So I'm going to talk about, maintenance planning and programming, and I think that these strategies really can be applied, scaled up or scaled down depending on the level of implementation within your community. So just to start, we'll run through these. Some of the key strategies for BGI O&M planning and programming. I think these types of strategies really go along with any kind of major initiative within a municipality or region. Commitment and funding clearly is the most critical element to start and kind of get things moving. And then in addition to that, planning and design are very important in terms of designing and planning for minimal and or effective maintenance for any kind of green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure program. Gaining community endorsement is critical. And looks like we've got some kind of, I don't know what that is, sorry. Gaining community endorsement is critical. Establishing policies and standards for O&M, education and training, and then monitoring and tracking those BGI systems is critical. So we'll touch on all these. In terms of commitment for GI maintenance, I really can't stress enough how important that is. Really having the political capital to advance a green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure program is critical, and then having the backup commitment to maintaining those systems. And a lot of times the drivers for this is related to regulatory requirements, and so a community is going to adopt policies and enforcement procedures to not only implement green infrastructure, but then maintain them. And that can happen both as public assets and then also in terms of enforcement for private stormwater systems and maintaining those systems. And a lot of that is baked into, community or municipal ordinances. Establishing responsible agency or staff within a community and providing that staff with adequate funding is critical to GI maintenance. And a lot of municipalities and communities are incorporating stormwater fees and credits to help both fund and provide incentives for meeting the maintenance requirements for green infrastructure. There we go. In terms of funding, some cost considerations, I think it's really critical to first of all establish a business case for green infrastructure maintenance and really looking at the incremental costs of maintaining green infrastructure compared to conventional infrastructure, because everything requires maintenance. Oftentimes, green infrastructure maintenance with respect to landscape is very similar to any other kind of parks or landscape maintenance budget. So that can be incorporated within already existing maintenance budgets within a community. Looking at economies of scale is a cost-saving strategy. It's a lot easier to keep maintenance crews busy full time. Trying to the more green infrastructure that you're implementing, oftentimes that can help be a cost saver. Also, when you're implementing, you can outsource these for contracts. So if you have a number of, bioretention type systems, you may be able to outsource that to a landscape contractor and have an economy of scale savings there. Note that O&M costs really do vary widely. It depends on the size and complexity of the green infrastructure system. Very highly visible locations will typically require more maintenance than a system that's not as obvious to the public. So all of those things factor into maintenance, and also maintenance is adaptable. So the images to the right, you can see that's the same system that the top image is in 2015, about 7 years after it was initially installed, and later, once the vegetation is established, for example, it requires less maintenance typically than in those first years of establishment. And really, there's not a whole lot of data out there right now that's reliable in terms of cost. So a lot of organizations are having to kind of look at what their own costs are in order to plan for that. As an example, here are some typical O&M costs per square foot for green infrastructure. When we look at this, we can see that the vegetated systems like bioretention on the right and infiltration trenches tend to be more expensive when we look at that as a dollar per square foot basis, just simply because they tend to have a little bit more maintenance required associated with the vegetation. But when we look at O&M costs per acre of impervious area that's managed, you can see that bioretention and the costs look a little bit lower, and that's because typically you can direct more runoff to a bioretention area, and it can manage more runoff per square foot than, say, a porous pavement system that's really just receiving the runoff that lands on it. So I think there's different ways that you can kind of manage your budgets and look at how cost-effective various green infrastructure technologies are. Some strategies for paying for green infrastructure maintenance. We talked about this a little bit. Stormwater utilities, I would say, are a very popular method for doing that. They provide a stable revenue source. It's an equitable approach. Typically, these fees are based on area of impervious surfaces for each property owner. And they also help to incentivize private investment, either through credit programs or other means that might allow for cost savings for those paying the fees. Some other types of strategies are alternative financing strategies, such as public-private partnerships. An example in Lancaster, actually, the city got Penvest funding, and they were able to partially fund private green infrastructure projects, and then the private property owner had to sign an agreement to then maintain it. So the city was able to help fund those systems, get a benefit from a green infrastructure perspective from the city, and then the private property owner actually was responsible for maintaining it. Another case study example is for a pretty large scale GI program that was in Onondaga County in Syracuse, New York. You can see there was over 170 projects built. There may even be more at this point. Quite a lot of green infrastructure, and some of the strategies that Onondaga used were to incorporate, first of all, incorporating green infrastructure into their existing CMMS tracking system. So they took an asset management approach to that and developed a maintenance, training, and inspection program, and then tracked that with their CMMS system. They also utilized, like I think I talked about earlier, large-scale O&M contracts as a cost savings for things like permeable pavements and any landscape O&M. They entered into community partnerships to provide low-cost training and entry-level jobs for disadvantaged youth in the community to provide them summer jobs to help cover the O&M of those landscaping type BMPs and GI. And then they also established a grant incentive program whereby they would help fund green infrastructure on private property. And then again, the private property owner had to sign an agreement to maintain that GI system for at least 10 years. So these are just some strategies, a nice example of a number of strategies used in this particular program. And we mentioned O&M and green jobs. Green infrastructure, it does require a workforce that has new skills. It can create long-term permanent jobs, whether it's inspection or maintenance. And we talked a little bit quickly about how youth can be engaged, and part-time job, entry-level jobs can be incorporated into a green infrastructure program. This is done in Onondaga. I think Philadelphia also has a similar program. Poor public awareness of green infrastructure can really, really put a nail in the coffin, if you will, of a green infrastructure initiative. Some of the strategies to really engage the public and that have been used in large-scale green infrastructure programs are tours and workshops. Program branding is critical. This is a website, Save It from Lancaster, where they have branded their green infrastructure program. Working with community groups like garden groups or park friends of the park type groups can be helpful to getting some assistance and getting public support behind green infrastructure. And then offering private property training and self-certification policies, particularly where development regulations require green infrastructure. Many communities are incorporating self-certification of those green infrastructure systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So we have another poll question here. What are the greatest challenges or concerns you have regarding blue-green infrastructure implementation? Is it cost, maintenance, public perception, lack of regulatory drivers, or others? Give you a couple more minutes here. Maybe we should have had all of the above. Yep, there we go. So it looks like maintenance. Well, I guess this is a timely presentation, and maintenance is really the highest, over 50%, and then costs. And in some cases, lack of regulatory drivers. So this is not surprising. I think that maintenance and cost are the things that we hear quite often as a concern. So let's talk about how to integrate maintenance into planning and policy. So really important first to figure out who will be maintaining the GI systems. Is it going to be something that will be staffed within the municipality or a city, or is it going to be outsourced, for example, or is it going to be something that will be the responsibility of private property owners and self-reporting? Setting up and standardizing maintenance procedures and developing training programs are critical to success, and then also establishing inspection and enforcement procedures to protect those assets and make sure that maintenance is actually taking place. Sorry, I went too far here. So here's an interesting case study from Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District, and here for this study, a framework, an O&M framework, was developed based on stakeholder input to figure out within the sewer district, which has had a number of municipalities, who should be responsible for doing the maintenance, whether it should be a regional entity, it should be controlled by the municipalities themselves, or if it should be a private endeavor. And the framework was looked at based on financial and financial considerations, the ability to be implemented, and then social and community impact. And through that polling and study with the stakeholders, it was actually recommended that the most cost-effective model would be to have a regional maintenance entity, but based on feedback from the stakeholders, it really wasn't recommended because municipalities and private property owners wanted to have control over their own maintenance. So in the end, the recommended or cost-effective model really wasn't acceptable to the stakeholders, and so that was modified. That the regional model was really only used for training, and then all the other maintenance control and responsibility was at the municipal and private level ultimately. When developing standard maintenance procedures, I think it's critical to understand that many of these maintenance activities for green infrastructure are not all that different than the maintenance that's already occurring at the municipal level in terms of inlet cleaning and landscape maintenance. A lot of it is quite similar. The maintenance procedures will vary, again, based on system function, visibility size, the drainage area size, the type of land cover. Green streets typically are going to have a lot more maintenance than a park site, just simply because of the usage and the amount of dirt and debris that you're going to find on a street compared to a park. And I think we mentioned this before, visibility matters. Anything that's visible on the surface will typically require more maintenance. At the same time, having a visible surface system is also very helpful because you can see when a system actually needs maintenance. Inspections should be established, an inspection routine, and a lot of times that's required for regulatory requirements. And I think we mentioned this earlier that maintenance will vary through time, so adaptive management is important to consider. Differences between blue versus green infrastructure maintenance. When we're talking about blue infrastructure, blue-green, larger storage systems tend to have more concentrated flows into a large system, larger drainage areas. But given that oftentimes those systems are designed with more robust pretreatment or sediment trash forebay, and often those types of larger systems require typically less maintenance or reduced frequency of maintenance, as long as those pretreatment systems are built in. Green infrastructure tends to be more distributed, have smaller drainage areas, so it's many small systems, if you will. And a lot of times, depending on the visibility or the type of system, they may require more frequent inspections and cleaning, simply because a smaller system isn't going to have the ability to have a larger, robust type pretreatment. And the combination of both, obviously, they overlap. It really depends on the technology that's being used. But even a large bioretention system is going to have a similar maintenance regime as a small bump out, for example. So a case study example here, O&M guidance manual. This was actually developed by Alcosan, who Alcosan implements a grant program to its member communities to help fund green infrastructure programs, and they put out a number of guidance manuals, but one of them was an O&M manual. And the manual established maintenance regimes for routine, non-routine, and general maintenance activities by green infrastructure type, and they looked at the typical green infrastructure systems that they were funding, which was infiltration trenches, bioretention, and permeable pavements were the three categories. Their plan covered maintenance frequencies, and you can see an example of that here. The frequencies are established dependent on service level, whether it's high, moderate, or low service level, and that really that touches on what we were talking about before with respect to visibility and type of GI technology. And the purpose, they also developed maintenance inspection checklists, including a self-certification process whereby the grant recipient would need to submit an annual self-certification form to Alcosan to demonstrate that they had been maintaining the system that was funded. And all of this was done, obviously designed to protect Alcosan's investment. So establishing inspection and enforcement policies and procedures. It's really critical to do this for both public and private systems. Developing and requiring inspection certification, as we talked about, and training programs is critical. There's opportunities for incorporating volunteer inspection programs, and then adapting enforcement policies is really important. You can have all of the training and the guidance out there, but if we're not enforcing it or checking on it, then systems can easily fall into disrepair and begin not to perform anymore. And we talked a little bit about fees and credits can help to provide incentives for maintaining the systems. Another case study here from San Francisco Public Utility Commission. They have, as part of their MS4 permit and their stormwater ordinance for developments both in private and public properties, in order to get permitted, the green infrastructure system needed to have a maintenance plan. And then the property owner would be required to submit a self-certification checklist on an annual basis. And then the Public Utility Commission themselves actually set up their own triennial maintenance inspection that would go out to each of these public and private sites and inspect them to ensure that they were actually being maintained. And they had the program included enforcement if they were found not to be in compliance. So a pretty robust program out of San Francisco for their MS4 permit. And then just some information on training. There's a number of training programs out there for green jobs training, and this is just a listing of some of those here. I won't go into them, but I'm sure that many have heard of the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. That's probably one of the biggest ones, but there's also one in Chesapeake Bay, Maryland, and some other states throughout the country also offer contractor training and maintenance training for inspectors as well as contractors that would perform the maintenance. And we have poll question 3 here before we move on to Kate. So what are the greatest challenges or concerns you have regarding maintaining blue-green infrastructure? Cost, lack of resources, whether it's equipment or staff, already have too many things to maintain, training, or other. A couple minutes here. Try to keep you all on your toes with these polls. It's interesting to see where everyone lands on these. Lack of resources, yeah, and cost. Again, not surprising, although training and cost actually both at about 20% there. Yeah, good to know. Oh, actually, I think we're going back to Dan.
Yes,
Sorry.
it's all good. Let's see if I can advance. Okay, so I'm going to jump back in here and cover design, certainly a subject near and dear to my heart as a design engineer. I can advance, there we go. So design clearly, sorry, I went too fast there. Design clearly impacts maintenance. As a design engineer, I have to think about, what I'm putting on the plan, can it be maintained? Will folks like Kate, who is ultimately responsible for making sure that these assets are functional over the long term, I want to make that, I want to facilitate that. I don't want to design something that can't be maintained, can't be inspected, and therefore will fail. And it's also, it's a feedback loop, right? So we've been working with the city of Lancaster for a number of years. We've been working in Onondaga County for a number of years, other places like Philadelphia. And we get feedback from maintenance that impacts design. So design impacts maintenance and vice versa. So here are some of the things that we think about when we're designing, thinking about maintenance. And really the first thing is we want to design for minimal maintenance, especially where resources are limited or when it's located on a private property. As Susan mentioned before, projects that require greater or specialized maintenance might be better suited for those sites that will have a lot of rigorous and ongoing maintenance, the schools and urban plazas and parks. So we have to really think about the context, the location of that project. Of course, we want to design pre-treatment that's going to ensure long-term functionality. Everything needs to be maintained. We really want to make sure that we provide those features of these projects that serve as the front line, if you will. The sacrificial lamb, all the trash, all the sediment, all the debris, everything is going to come in to a single source. We want it to come into a single source or as few sources as possible, because then we can clean that out. And kind of the next bullet kind of goes along with that. We want to design for ease of inspection, ease of maintenance. We want to put something in that's very accessible, that the staff and we know who they are, ideally, what their capabilities are. We want to make sure that they can get in and do what they have to do and leave that site with a cleaned, blue-green infrastructure projects. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, not too much, but on the vegetation side of things. I'm an engineer, I'm not a landscape architect, so bear with me a little bit here. But we first really need, and this gets back to the context of the site, we have to understand the context, the soil conditions, the hydrologic conditions. For example, if we are designing a bioretention system with very sandy soils, we want to make sure that our plant species are drought tolerant. Those soils could drain out pretty quick and could create dry conditions. We want to make sure we're designing for that. If we're designing green infrastructure in the roadway, which we do all the time, and the city of Lancaster has numerous examples, we want to make sure that the plants that we're specifying are salt tolerant. They can handle that environment. They're going to thrive in that environment. We want to make sure that we're avoiding bare areas, and I'll get more into that in a second. We want to consider a layered or mixed plant community approach rather than just large swaths of species. And we'll talk more about that in a second too. And really, we have to be realistic about the maintenance capabilities, the resources that are at our disposal, and the preferences of the community. We can't ignore any of those things. So back to the employee strategies to avoid bare areas. Really, we're concerned about two things here. It's erosion and it's weeds. So with erosion, we want to think about how we can prevent against erosion. So we might want to use biodegradable erosion control fabric, especially on slopes, knowing that before the plants are established, they're going to be susceptible. That those slopes, the soil is going to be susceptible to erosion. So we want to make sure that we put in the fabric as needed. We want to place tougher plants near points of entry to runoff, and they're going to act as kind of natural energy dissipators. And that's not necessarily replacing, but more like in addition to structural energy dissipators that we might have using concrete or rocks or things like that. We want to plant densely, i.e. use a denser spacing to eliminate the opportunities for weeds. And we want to, kind of along the same lines, consider a layered plant community approach. This is the idea of green mulch, where we use diminutive filler species to kind of fill in the gaps. And doing this kind of layered approach really does improve the resilience of the system, especially to varying conditions of light and water. So we want a hardy, robust, resilient system, especially when it's in the roadway. And again, as I mentioned before, we want to realistically assess the capabilities of our maintenance staffs and our community preference. We want to try, if possible, to keep our plant palettes simple, maybe lump together those species that have similar types of maintenance. So maybe grasses and perennials get lumped together and shrubs are separate. Maintenance staff may not know how to distinguish between weeds and the desired plants in those systems. I have a rain garden that takes up half of my front yard, and I've been working with green infrastructure for years, and I struggle with is that a plant? Is that a weed? It's hard to tell, and so we really do need to make sure we provide our staff with the proper training and the proper resources. And then with respect to the community, we want to think about what they might like. Is a more naturalistic palette, which will look weedy, is that okay? Or do we want something that's more garden-like? So we got to keep all these things in mind. Now we have a quick activity here. We're not going to do this as a poll. We're just going to kind of run through these. But this really is meant to be fun, just to maybe test your knowledge of is it a weed or is it a plant that we would use in a green infrastructure system like bioretention. So here's the first one. Is it a weed or a plant? And the answer is it is a green infrastructure plant. It's a bushy blue stem. Here's another one. This is a bump out that was it's in the city of Lancaster, and that is full of weeds. Those are not intended to be planted there. Those popped up, I think, in the interim between system installation and planting, which happened a little bit later. Here's another one. Is this a weed or a plant? And that is a plant. That's Juncus. Another one here, weed or plant. That is a weed, alligator weed. And I think this is the last one, weed or plant. And yes, if you said plant, then you were correct. It's a gold sturm. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate, who's going to finish this off.
All right, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I thought we'd talk a little bit about the City of Lancaster's program, how we've developed over time, and some of the opportunities and challenges that we have faced over the last 10 or so years of our program. There we go. Okay. Oop, I went too far. All right, so our program, we instituted our green infrastructure plan in 2011 and really started pretty much immediately installing demonstration projects. So some of the projects we'll talk about today are 10 or more years old now, and our program has grown along with in that time as well. So we started out in the beginning, there was really one program staff, which was the Director of Public Works, and now we have 4 full-time staff in our Division of Sustainability and Environment. In addition, we have 3 maintenance staff, green infrastructure maintenance staff in our Parks Department who are trained specifically on green infrastructure maintenance. All of our program staff, inspectors, and field staff are all certified through the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Certification Program. We found that to be a really fantastic program for having our own staff go through, so that we're all at a similar level of understanding what these practices are, how they're supposed to be performing, understanding what to look for in terms of inspections, and what maintenance should look like. And so as well, we've been hosting it in the city of Lancaster, and so we've seen many private contractors go through the program as well, which has really helped to kind of build that institutional knowledge in the contractor community who are also installing these practices in private projects. In order to keep up with all of our installations that we have throughout the city, we do regular field inspections and performance testing. Our inspector inspects every green infrastructure installation once every 30 days, and we track everything in an asset management system. Once she completes the field inspection, that information is immediately transferred to our maintenance team so that they can address the issues that she's noting in her inspections. And yeah, so some of the things that we're also tracking is just the design performance of these systems, gallons of stormwater that we're capturing annually. We're looking at how many permits and credits we're issuing each year. We do have a stormwater ordinance that requires the installation of stormwater management practices for any installation of impervious surface over 100 square feet. So we have a number of permits that go through every year. So we've got the projects that are being implemented by the city on the public side and also privately through that permit system. And we are tracking through our projects the pounds of nutrients that are diverted, as well as all of our public outreach and interactions. We really see public engagement as a really key piece to the success of our program, making sure that residents understand and have an appreciation for the green infrastructure projects that we're investing in with their tax dollars. And because it is such public-facing infrastructure, we often get a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So it's important that we are always ready to engage with residents. In terms of inspections, like I said, we're doing that on a monthly basis and really tracking that functionality over time and identifying problem areas that need to be addressed. And if we have something more significant, what might need a more in-depth corrective action. And so, yeah, Susan had touched on a little bit the varying costs of O&M for green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. So we have our estimated costs. One of the things we are hoping to track over time with our asset management is our costs for our green infrastructure maintenance program. So we are tracking both, the time spent doing the maintenance itself, also any of the equipment used, vehicles, everything of that nature, so that we can have a full picture of the real cost. So hopefully we've just started tracking this in the last couple of years, and so we'll be able to start compiling that data. All right, so talk a little bit about Brandon Park. I think it's going to load in some layers here. So this is a large public park in the southwest part of this city. And when we were starting to install green infrastructure demonstration projects at the beginning of our program, we first prioritized public parks as great opportunities for installation. We were also at the time looking at some upgrades of our park system, of our parks throughout the city. And so the timing worked out well for also including green infrastructure. So in Brandon Park, we have a system of about 20 interconnected rain gardens that are under-drained and kind of flow into each other, as well as a 4-court porous asphalt basketball court. and as well, and some porous asphalt paving in the parking areas. So we are capturing a significant amount of stormwater runoff from the impervious areas in the park itself, as well as some adjacent surfaces from the residential areas surrounding. Yeah, we're getting that 4 million gallons reduction a year there. So some of the issues that we have faced in Brandon Park, we've learned a lot of lessons since this was an early installation. We have really identified where we are seeing issues with soil erosion from runoff from adjacent impervious areas, and where we have maybe needed to either put in some tougher plants in those entry areas, or sometimes reinforce with some stone to address those areas of erosion. We have also had challenges with the initial planting, the density being a little on the lower side. When we started many of our installations, the pallets were more larger shrubs and a more minimal amount of ground cover perennials. And we've really changed our plant palette over time while we still do use shrubs in our plantings, from time to time, we look at that density of planting that Dan talked about, and really having that layered plant community approach. And so that has really helped to improve the success of the vegetation in the systems and their performance over time. So in addition to our park projects, we, as we're in the Department of Public Works, looking at public right-of-ways and opportunities for installation of green streets. You know, there's a lot of challenges that come with those opportunities. We're a very old city with old infrastructure, and we're a pretty small, dense city. We're only 60,000 people, but about half of the city is impervious, and so there's not always the wide spaces for, we have pretty narrow streets. So when we're looking to install these, it can be a challenge. So we're looking at, have to consider utility conflicts, making sure to protect our existing tree canopy that we're looking to increase. And so we certainly want to protect the ones that are in place. Looking at things like street slope and limited space. Because these are very public spaces, this is, you know, the right of way, public perception and education is very important so that people understand what these areas are. We certainly, one of the big issues we and deal with public perception is making sure that we don't lose as few parking spaces as at all possible. That is the quickest way to lose public support, is to eliminate some parking spaces. And so we want to take that into consideration as well. But there's also a surprising amount of debris that accumulates in our roadways and on our sidewalks. And so these our bump outs tend to be areas that collect a significant amount of sediment. Sediment's probably our biggest challenge that we face, but also trash, debris, working to train our staff not to dump salt-laden snow into the rain gardens, but also private property owners not shoveling their snow into the rain gardens is important as well. So a lot of things to consider in the public right of way. So two of our really successful projects that we have installed in the last few years, we were able to convert two formerly one-way streets to two-way streets. So Mulberry Street and Charlotte Street within the city. And with both of these projects, we really took a complete streets approach to the design. So we wanted to, of course, from the stormwater perspective, we wanted to prioritize installing green infrastructure, but we really looked at how we could utilize green infrastructure to provide a safer travel area for vehicles, for pedestrians, for bicyclists, and all users of the roadway and the sidewalks. And so the curbside rain gardens or bump outs really are able to serve as traffic calming by narrowing the roadway width, and also creating just kind of some safer areas for crossing for pedestrians. So looking at all of these combined, and also being able to leverage the cost savings of looking at a capital project that we were looking to invest in and had a palette of funding opportunities that come with the roadway work, and leveraging that to be able to also install the green infrastructure. So pulling all of this together really made for a financially feasible project at a very large scale. So both of these streets we were looking at about 5 city blocks, and so pretty significant in size. Community outreach was a really important piece for both of these as well. These are residential neighborhoods largely, with some small businesses interspersed in between, but making sure that residents understood the projects being installed and the importance of them, and working with them through the delays of construction and things of that nature and how that affects their neighborhood. But in the end, residents have been very pleased with the outcome of these 2 installations. And yeah, so collaboration and adaptive design are really the keys here. And so internally, the collaboration we're looking at is with our city planning department, looking at enhancing the bike lanes, tree plantings and protection, community engagement, working with PennDOT for state roadways, and looking at any additional reviews and specifications that are required there. Integrating the design from everything with traffic, signals, green infrastructure, utilities. Utilities is always a challenge because our utility companies are frequently doing work in the right of way, and we want to coordinate with them the best that we can to make sure that we are taking into account any work that they will be doing, and hopefully scheduling it so that we can phase it in so that our newly installed surfaces are not immediately being torn up for utility upgrades. So having those open conversations have been really important. And working, within the Department of Public Works, having Stormwater Bureau working closely with our engineering department. And in terms of adaptive design, really looking at how can we simplify the grading when we are dealing with slopes on our roadways to create more level beds for the runoff to infiltrate into the soils. Looking at that surface pretreatment and energy dissipation, that's really one of the areas that we've learned a lot, I would say, over the last 10 years. And we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of our design there. Looking at tree assessment, so protecting and replacing street trees as needed. And yeah, let's see.
Kate, I'll just jump in a second. We have about 2 minutes left. I'd love to just continue, and hopefully folks can stick around for extra minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions as well. So if you're okay to just finish up, then yeah, that'd be great.
That sounds great. It looks like things are frozen up here is the problem. So maybe we'll see if we're going to advance or not.
Okay, there we go.
There we go. Okay. So this is looking at a bit about that simplified grading that I just talked about, and creating those level beds for infiltration and for the health of the vegetation. So not having the steep side slopes has been really important. And yeah, so looking at that pretreatment. So Stone cobbles have really become kind of the bane of my existence when they are pre-treatment. They tend to get really filled with sediment, and they're very difficult to clean out. I'm going to move on to the next photo to kind of show what we have moved on to design as an alternative. So instead of having that kind of large area of stone cobbles when the water enters the system, we have moved to a concrete sediment forebay with these kind of toothed edges to serve as energy dissipation. And so that has performed a lot better for us. And I'm going to show some before and after photos. I believe the next one. Yeah. So this was, we did a retrofit to our project at Plum and Walnut Streets. And you can see in the first image, the kind of channel of cobbles that the water would enter. This became incredibly laden with sediment and very difficult to clean out. So we actually removed all of this. We did all this work in-house, removed the stone cobbles and put in this pie-shaped sediment forebay. What is really nice about this is, it's a little bit counterintuitive installing more concrete into a rain garden, but what we lose in pervious area, we gain in the ability to intercept that, that sediment accumulation before it gets into the soil. And because it's so highly visible on the concrete, it's very easy for our maintenance staff to get in with either a vacuum attachment or just a flat edge shovel and clean that out. We have also started introducing some more integrated inlet and pretreatment structures like the rain garden products, the turret and the bunker. And then we'll just wrap up with some permeable pavement lessons learned. So we have installed a significant amount of permeable pavements throughout the city, whether it's asphalt, permeable concrete, or pavers. We've used it with great success on areas like basketball courts, and with some more challenges in some areas like our private alleys. And so what we have really found over time is that the systems, this is an example of that, forecourt basketball court at Brandon Park. And so we've really learned that adjacent surfaces make or break your porous pavement installation. And so where we have done alleyways and we have unimproved parking spaces, driving that sediment over the surface pretty quickly clogs it. Also, tree cover, leaf debris can be a real challenge for porous pavements and requires a much more rigorous maintenance schedule of vacuum sweeping if it is there. So we have found a lot more success with more of the more open spaces with less of the tree cover, such as the basketball courts. And so what we've really looked at in our roadways is the introduction of permeable pavers. And so these systems work really well. If we do have an issue with clogging, we can pull out some of those pavers and address the issue directly rather than having to deal with the entire surface. And the lack of the gravel between these pavers, they've got these kind of lugs on the sides that keep the spacing to allow the water to drain in, makes it fairly easy for maintenance. And so we use our vacuum sweeper to maintain and restore the porosity of those surfaces. All right, so with that, we've got some resources that, that you are welcome to take a look at, and we're happy to share. I'll go through those quickly, and then we can move on to some questions.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks like we still have some folks on the call, and yeah, I don't know if any questions have come in on the chat. At least I'm not seeing them. But yeah, no, a lot of great lessons. I think the good news for other communities is that cities like Lancaster have been doing this, have been maintaining and learning all these hard lessons. So it's I think Kate's misfortune could benefit other communities. It's all these hard lessons that we learn designing and implementing these projects and maintaining them, I think other communities can benefit from that.
Hey, Daniel, this is Megan. I have questions that came in.
Oh, you do?
First one-
Okay.
I do. The first one is for Kate. What keeps you up at night regarding BGSI?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I think that because we installed so many demonstration projects early in our program, and we didn't have an active inspection or maintenance program until 2016, really. So we had like a good 4 years where we were addressing some things, but not everything. And so keeping up with some of the retrofits that now require retrofits is, so it's always harder to find the funding to fix a project that for whatever reason is not functioning well than it is to install it in the first place. So that's probably one of our big challenges.
And another question, how were the BGI costs developed? Are those Jacobs projects or sourced from another data?
So I think, Kate, your costs were actual city costs that you presented. Is that correct?
I think those were estimated costs. We have not been able to, kind of pull together all of our costs based on our asset management yet. But yeah.
Okay, our the costs that I presented on in that graph were average estimated costs or average costs from other projects. So they were from a number of sources, but they were not necessarily directly related to like one program. For example, with what Kate is looking at doing now, we had kind of sourced that information from a number of programs and resources to come up with those estimates. So they're estimated. I know there's some publication that ASCE, I believe, has a publication out with the cost of GI maintenance I think it's mostly related around bioretention, but provides a number of sources from a number of different programs and locations if you're interested. And that may be listed in one of those resources on the presentation.
Okay, and one last question, if we can slip it in. How is BGSI in the ROW handled in regards to on-call and utility markouts?
So can you repeat that, Megan?
Yeah.
How is BGSI in the ROW handled, in the row handled in regards to one-call and utility markouts?
Oh, so I guess you're asking, Kate, this is, I think, is related to how do you mark out green infrastructure for one calls, right? So I guess, I think it obviously would vary, but do you have information on that, Kate? How does I mean, since green infrastructure is a city asset, do you have like, I don't know who's responsible for doing that at the city, like marking out GI locations? I mean, we do have in the design, we've designed them so that they have like wires, like, we have like detection wire and detection tape around infiltration trenches so that they can be located. I just don't know the logistics of how the city marks them out, for example. I don't know if you do either.
Yeah, I don't know that we have, we certainly, like, on our plans, do our best to make sure that we have those marked for future maintenance. Like if we're needing to get in there, we have had situations where utility companies have come in and moved a line and not informed us of it, and it's going through, through a bed that we could potentially, put a shovel through a gas line. We certainly don't want to do that. And so I think having that open communication is important. But in terms of the markouts themselves, that's not something I handle. So yeah, I'm not sure about that.
But the systems are designed with detection tape around trenches, for example, that are underneath pavement. And then for any kind of piping that's associated with the green infrastructure, we incorporate tracer wire in our designs.
That is it.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your time, for sticking around a little bit longer. And again, thanks to SPC, the Water Resource Center, for hosting this event.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and please, if you have other questions, don't hesitate to email us.
Thank you.